Voters, the League of Women Voters of Montgomery County is celebrating its 100th anniversary this year. In 1920, when women won the right to vote, the League was also established, and our mission was and is to educate and to register voters. So we're very happy that you could be with us tonight. I'm Marcia Kingman. I'm the co-vice president for programming for the League. My partner in programming is Linda Cohen. Linda is going to facilitate the question and answer period after Bret's talk. Before we start our program tonight, I hope that you will join me and pay tribute to a woman who has fought alongside of us on the same side of issues for many years, Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg. To honor her, I would like to quote her. She said, "Fight for the things you care about, but do it in a way that will lead others to join you." May she rest in peace. Let's take a minute to review the protocol for tonight. This meeting is being recorded. Participants will be muted at the start of the program. I believe you all are currently muted. Participants should have their own video off to conserve bandwidth. It is recommended that participants have their Zoom view in speaker mode. Bret Schafer will take questions after the presentation. Participants who want to ask questions need to raise their hand via the blue icon in the participants box. Will you please check and find that blue icon, the blue hand icon now, so that you'll be ready to ask questions when Bret is finished with his talk. And now, a special welcome and thank you to our presenter, Bret Schafer. Mr. Schafer is a cosmopolitan and accomplished gentleman. When I read his bio on the website of the Alliance for Securing Democracy, where he works, I noticed that one of his accomplishments was playing semi-professional baseball in Germany. Another was being a radio host in Budapest, and he was an intern in the US Embassy in Russia. But the reason he's here tonight is because he is an expert in computational propaganda. As an expert in disinformation campaigns, he has appeared in the New York Times, USA Today, the Wall Street Journal, and the Washington Post. And he has also been interviewed on NPR, MSNBC, CNN, Al Jazeera, and CBS and BBC Radio. Thank you for being here tonight, Brent. Please help us to understand the threatening world of disinformation.
Thank you, and it's great to be here. I think this is my third time joining a various League event. So I'm really glad to be back, glad that the turnout looks so great on a Monday night. So I'm gonna start with a presentation. I hope to keep it to about 20 to 25 minutes. If at any time when I'm going through this, if something is not clear, if I get to kind of deep into the weeds of technical jargon, please cut me off and ask the question. This is not meant to be like a very formal presentation, so I'm happy to take questions as we go. The only thing is once I start presenting, I won't be able to see you because I'll just be looking at my PowerPoint. So feel free to interrupt me at any time. So I'm gonna share my screen now. And okay. Let me just make this bigger. Oops, there we go. Okay, so when we talk about disinformation, I think it's important to have a sort of starting point of what we're actually talking about, because oftentimes the term is used incorrectly. Sometimes we conflate misinformation with disinformation. So the difference there, it's pretty simple. Misinformation is just basically when people are wrong. So it's false information, but there's no real intent behind it. Where disinformation is where there actually is an intent to mislead the audience. So this is where we see foreign actors intentionally going on social media, putting out false information, which is very different from being on your Facebook feed and having a cousin or an uncle who just happens to be wrong, which I think we all have in our lives, and they're very different things. But also when we talk about disinformation, we tend to focus a lot on the content itself. So false, misleading, or manipulated audio, video, or text. But really, oftentimes what we see is it's more of an actor and behavior problem. So I'm going to kind of go over the differences there and why when we focus on disinformation, we tend to spend more time looking at the behavior behind disinformation campaigns and not actually the content itself. So just to walk through some of the actors who have been involved in the past or are currently involved in disinformation campaigns, of course, what we generally think about are nation states. So the Kremlin's IRA, which is their troll factory run out of St. Petersburg. Of course, it's been covered extensively, the impact that that group had on the 2016 election. Just a few weeks ago, Facebook and Twitter actually took down some pages and accounts that they connected to the IRA. So it's still operational. It doesn't seem to be quite as effective as it was 4 years ago, but it's still out there. Obviously, the Chinese, the Iranians, many other nation states have the capacity to try to influence people on social media. An Oxford research report, I think, identified 70 different countries whose governments are now running trolling campaigns online. Now, many of those are targeting their own audiences, not foreign audiences, but that just shows an explosion over the past 4 or 5 years in terms of the actors who have started to engage in disinformation campaigns. But I think the thing that is concerning as we move towards 2020 is just the explosion of threat actors besides nation states who have always tried to interfere in our electoral processes. So I highlight here the marketplace of manipulation. And what that means is it's now sort of, it's not a black market, it's an open market for companies who will offer disinformation services to people or groups for a cost. So these sort of disinformation as a service, disinformation for hire companies are out there. Some are operating in Belarus or the Philippines. Some are operating in the US. And if you go to Google and you run a search, for example, how do you manipulate search results on Google? Google will give you those results, and they'll give you companies who will run disinformation campaigns for you. They'll also give you companies who will give you fake followers, fake clicks, fake likes. So there's this entire marketplace now of manipulation that exists. And what that means is you don't actually have to be a nation state with a nation state budget to run a disinformation campaign. You can be an individual or a group with a little bit of money and some bad intentions, and you can target a political opponent. Obviously, it's quite difficult to target a national election, but I don't think we pay enough attention to some of the down ballot candidates. You know, for under $1,000, if you wanted to run a smear or attack campaign against a political opponent, you can do that. And you don't need to be particularly technically sophisticated because, again, all of these companies are out there. They're all pretty easy to find just by running a normal Google search, which means we're now dealing with a whole different level in terms of the various threat actors online. So the second level to talk about is the behavior. So these are really the tactics and techniques that some of the actors use to deceive audiences online. And I think the important thing here is often when we talk about manipulation and the behavioral approach to disinformation, the content itself is not necessarily false or misleading. So as you see on your screen here, this is an account on the right that was set up by the Internet Research Agency prior to 2016. It was taken down in 2017, purporting to be a Black activist. This account, by the time it was taken down, had something like 40,000 followers. It had been quoted in at least 12 major US publications. And of course, it was being run by a guy sitting in St. Petersburg. So when you look at the actual content there, most of it wasn't false. It was talking about issues that most Black activists would be talking about. But the deception was you had someone sitting in St. Petersburg whose intent was to sort of infiltrate Black activist movements and to try to move the conversation just slightly, an inch or two in different directions in order to try to influence outcomes. So one of the things we saw, of course, in 2016 in the targeting of Black activists was this effort to try to depress enthusiasm for Hillary Clinton. So the message that we saw consistently there was, you know, support a third-party candidate, don't turn out to vote, neither candidate represents us. And on the left there, this is actually just from the other day, this Peace Data website that was taken down by Facebook and Twitter, that again was connected to the Internet Research Agency. What that site was doing was they were actually recruiting real American freelance authors and journalists to write content that was targeting progressive audiences. So again, this shows sort of a maturation in their approach and a sort of more sophisticated attempt to actually get American content funded by the Russians, but to sort of manipulate it and to hide who is behind it as a way, again, to gain an audience. And once you gain an audience, you can, again, manipulate that audience. So one of the other things we see in terms of the behavior, we see this sort of spamming of messages across social media. So this is an investigation we did looking into a couple accounts that were boosting Chinese state media messaging. So as you see, they all have the same picture. They basically had the same profile. And we saw hundreds of these accounts that were just flooding social media with the same message over and over and over again. And we'll talk about a little bit later what that actually does, because it manipulates things in a way that's a little bit different than just you seeing it, sort of a one-to-one interaction, because it manipulates the algorithms and it manipulates what the social media companies think is popular and think is actually going viral. So it's more of a perception hacking. And then again, we sometimes see impersonation. So this is an account on the left that is an authentic Radio Free Asia, which is of course a US government news outlet. And on the right, the Chinese government basically creating an impersonation account that looks exactly the same. It changed one letter in its handle. But the difference is, and again, this is key and we'll go back to this later, the account on the left has this blue badge, this blue check mark. And we'll talk about why that is incredibly important. And I think that's actually something the League can be very helpful with when we talk about what we need to do to get election officials to get their social media accounts verified and secured. So this kind of impersonation is harder to pull off. So finally, the content. Again, the content is what we always focus on. I'm sure at this point, you've all seen tons of examples of fake news or Russian disinformation campaigns, the kind of polarizing material that we have seen consistently over the past few years. And of course, this would go to things like deepfake audio and video, which is the ability essentially to make someone say or look like they did something that they never said or never did. So in the election context, there are basically three different buckets that we look at in terms of different types of disinformation campaigns we can see. The first one, and we've seen this honestly forever, but it's obviously been digitized and updated, is voter suppression efforts. So this is the classic stuff of false information about how, when, and where to vote. Also false claims of violence at the polls or intimidation or arrest. Obviously that all happens and is real, but we sometimes see these false claims spread as a way of keeping people at home or of just creating an emotional reaction, of making people, you know, violent or furious about what they're seeing online. And we can see this before or during the election, on election day itself. The good news about voter suppression disinformation campaigns is in almost every case, it violates terms of service of the social media companies. So if you find it and report it and it gets to the right person, they will take it down because it is in clear violation of the rules. So the second level we look at are voter fraud disinformation campaigns. So this is false claims of illegal voting, of machines malfunctioning. So we've seen videos that seem to show somebody going into a voting booth, pressing an all Republican ticket, and it's showing an all Democratic ticket as what's coming out. Of course, in this election, what we're particularly concerned about are campaigns looking at the opportunity to steal or tamper with mail-in ballots. And again, this can occur before or after an election. In this particular election, we are particularly concerned about the after-election period, and we'll talk about that a little later. What is difficult here is it may or may not violate the company's terms of service. So if someone just goes online and says, you know, I think the US Postal Service is not reliable, they're losing ballots, I don't trust it, that's fair game. They won't take that down. Now, if they put a specific claim out there that is provable and false, that may be able to be removed, but it's tough to adjudicate, much more difficult than voter suppression. And finally, the third bucket is political disinformation. I'm not going to focus very much on that here because it's probably not the role of the league to get involved in political disinformation. We don't do very much of it unless we can see it's coming from a foreign actor. But this would just be false or misleading stories about an individual candidate or their party. So all of the things about Pizzagate that we saw in 2016, I mean, there's sort of endless political disinformation campaigns we can point to. But those rarely violate terms of service. And again, I'm not going to focus too much on them because I think they're a little far afield for what we want to cover here. So some specific campaigns we've seen in the past. These are both, well, one is from 2016, one is from 2018. The one on the left, I'm particularly concerned about this kind of voter suppression campaign this year because of COVID. We'll talk about that later, but this is something we saw in 2016, right before the election pop up. The Russians didn't put this out, but they helped to amplify it, which was essentially a very targeted campaign at Clinton supporters. We also saw it get really more micro-targeted than this, with appeals to Black and Latino voters, saying essentially, you don't have to go out to the polls. You can sit at home, you can text in your vote, you can email your vote, you can tweet your vote, and it will be registered. Now that looks like a legitimate Clinton campaign mailer or message. Obviously, that's just completely false. Now in 2016, I think that probably was not particularly effective because I think most people were planning on just showing up to the polls and voting the way that they've always voted in the past. I'm obviously very concerned about that in 2020 because people are going to be looking for alternative voting options. There are new alternative voting options, which means this kind of messaging will have more credibility this time around. Then there's a few voter fraud examples. All of these come from either Russian state-backed media or the Russian Internet Research Agency. So here's what I was talking about of claims that when they selected a particular candidate or ticket on a voting machine, the machine itself tried to rig their vote, or that illegals were voting. On the right there, this is actually more recently in the last couple of weeks, coming out of Russian state media, attempting to seed the ground of saying that voting fraud is real, it's no myth, it's going to happen, here's how we're doing it kind of thing. So what we're seeing the Russians doing right now is really creating, and of course, it's not just the Russians, obviously their own political leaders are doing the same thing, creating a very ripe environment for people to believe that voter fraud is a legitimate thing. It not only can happen, it likely will happen, which means when we see actual campaigns further down the line, those are going to have more credibility. It's going to have a more receptive audience. So as I mentioned, I have many specific concerns this time around because of COVID. There's just going to be more voters who are actively seeking out alternative voting options. And that just means more people are likely to come in contact with false information. You know, sort of basic math there. The more people who are online searching out information, the more likely they're going to get false information. And bad actors know this. They know the search terms to target, and they will carpet bomb specific terms like, are mail-in ballots safe? And they will try to manipulate what shows up in people's search feeds, either in Google search results or in their social media feeds. So of course, any changes, especially last minute changes, that's going to create an opportunity because there's going to be voter confusion. Anytime there's a disruption to the status quo, that is a perfect opportunity for disinformation actors because people just don't know what's true and false, and they're seeking out credible information, and there's often a lag time between credible information catching up with the false information. And then, of course, as we discussed, increase in voter fraud narratives around mail-in and absentee ballots. One of the things you may have heard about is the so-called Red Mirage. What we now know from polling is there's a huge difference in terms of Republicans and Democrats in terms of who plans to mail in their ballots. There's also likely going to be a very difference between urban and rural centers. So on the night of the election, what is very likely is it's going to show President Trump with a fairly sizable lead, just because rural counties with fewer people are going to start reporting first, and fewer Republicans plan to mail in their ballots, so those votes will be counted sooner. So you're going to see what seems to be a sizable lead start to chip away over the next couple days. Of course, this is going to create an opportunity for disinformation campaigns. Now I'm going to kind of change gears slightly here. You'll have to bear with me because this is going to seem kind of completely out of left field. But I wanted to talk a bit about information manipulation in the context of really the architecture of the internet and how algorithms work and how all of this manipulation that we see can affect things on the back end, which will affect what you see on the front end. So this is an example I like to give of sort of a real world information manipulation campaign, but at a very sort of basic benign level. So there was a restaurant in London called the Shed at Dulwich. Now the Shed at Dulwich was a sort of avant-garde restaurant, very small, impossible to get a reservation. It was based in London, it came online, it registered with TripAdvisor. I think most of us have probably used TripAdvisor in the past to get restaurant recommendations when we travel, hotel recommendations, everything else. It's very credible, it's reliable. So the Shed at Dulwich came online. It started, as all new restaurants do, as the last place restaurant in London. Now over time, it started getting positive reviews and more positive reviews, and word of mouth. It was really building up this reputation. So in a matter of about 9 months, it went from the last place restaurant in London to the #1 restaurant in London, a city with over 18,000 restaurants. It was impossible to get a reservation. People were calling, you could never get through. And the reason you couldn't get a reservation or get through is because this restaurant never existed. It was a prank, it was a joke. A reporter for Vice News decided to show how easy it was to game recommendations. And he just set up this completely fake restaurant. Didn't have an address, didn't have anything. All he got was a mobile phone number so he could occasionally take calls saying, I'm sorry, we're booked tonight. And he just had his friends post fake reviews. So this is one guy with no real resources, no technical savvy, and a few friends who were able to game the most credible review site online and make a restaurant that didn't exist the most popular restaurant in London. So I bring that up because this is often what happens when we talk about false information and why it shows up in your feeds, which is of course the main thing. If people were just pushing out false information and disinformation and nobody ever saw it, it wouldn't be a concern. But sophisticated bad actors really know how to game the systems. And so when we talk about how do we fight back against it, we need to understand how they're gaming it so that we can, not by using manipulation techniques, but by using sort of credible grassroots activism, fight back against what they're doing. So this is a quote I like from a colleague of mine who says, if you make it trend, you make it true. If you can get something that shows up at the top of people's social media feeds, or at the top of a Google search result, or at the top of an Amazon search result, people think that that is credible. Their understanding of how search engines work is they are designed to give you the most credible, reliable bits of information. And generally speaking, that's true. But of course, like everything, it can be gamed and it can be manipulated. So they do that through a variety of tactics. One is just high volume posting. You post early, you post often, you post from multiple sources on multiple platforms, and you repeat it over and over and over again. Because the search engine, the algorithms there that we hear so much talk about, they read things based on virality. What is popular? What are people talking about? How many different people are talking about? And of course, that all can be manipulated through bots, through paid trolls. So when you go to a Google search and you type in just a neutral search term, often what you see has been gamed behind the scenes. So, when I talk to my mom about what I do, she will say, I'm on Facebook to see pictures of my grandchildren. I don't engage in political conversations. I'm not having conversations with Russian trolls. That all is true. But in her news feeds that she is seeing, consciously or unconsciously, that is being manipulated often behind the scenes by bad actors, foreign and domestic, who want particular messages to show up in front of people's faces without them really realizing or understanding how it's there. So one of the ways they do this is by attacking what we call data voids. Data voids, it's a sort of complicated, it's a complicated term in some ways, but in some ways it's quite simple. So what a data void is a search term for which the available or relevant data is limited, non-existent, or deeply problematic. What that means is, think of Google as a massive library. So if you go into that library and you ask the librarian or type in a Google search, give me the best result for World War II history. There is so much content there that search engine has, and that search engine has seen so many searches that it is prepared to give you a credible, reliable result. Where the search engines fail, and Google will tell you this is just, it's built into the system, is when people search for something and there's just not very many books in the library, because it's still going to serve you something. That's the way it's built. And if there's not credible, reliable information there, it is going to serve you unreliable, less credible information. So this is particularly problematic in breaking news, in cycles where there's a breaking news event where a ton of people are searching. Think of a mass shooting, for example. When in the immediate aftermath, we maybe have heard an initial report, people search to see what's going on. Credible journalists are still finding out facts, but people trying to misinform the public have already started posting, and posting at a high volume. So when people just search in, think El Paso Walmart shooting, in the first few hours afterwards, they were often served up content that just came from a Reddit thread or came from a completely unreliable blog post. And that's what's deeply concerning when the general public is searching out information in a fast-moving information environment, like Election Day. If things happen as things are moving, everything can be gamed to give them results that aren't very reliable, aren't very credible. And again, the bad actors are so very sophisticated in how they target data voids. We know white nationalists, for example, consistently in their posts will misspell the word Holocaust because they know a certain amount of people will have a typo when they put it in. And those who have the typo will then be led to far-right news posts, because they understand the search engine is not going to give most users their content if people just search for the word Holocaust. There's a lot of very credible, reliable information out there. But people who put in a typo, credible news organizations aren't going to have that typo. So then they are sent down this rabbit hole into neo-Nazi far-right content. So we see this all the time, of these very sophisticated attempts to try to mislead users, to try to mislead viewers. Another thing is called typo squatting. So I'm sure we've all tried to type in Amazon, for example, screwed up one letter, and you're sent to this kind of weird site. Bad actors will do that with credible news organizations. So if you're trying to find information on particularly a local news source, again, you misspell one thing, you're sent to a less credible site that is attempting to mislead you. So that is the sort of the landscape of threats. But now I've kind of laid out this a bit apocalyptic kind of view of where we are in terms of disinformation. I want to talk about what we can do to fight back, and particularly what the League of Women Voters can do in terms of combating disinfo. So the first thing, and I can't kind of stress this enough, is create content and post often. As I said, the bad actors are online posting at a very high repetition because they know that's going to game how the search engines and how the news feeds on social media work. So you need to fight that just by posting more and posting credible information. Also focus on pre-bunking instead of debunking. What that means is we often take a sort of reactionary approach to disinformation. We see a bit of information that's false. We want to disprove that information or prove it to be false. But of course, at that point, we are behind the curve, because what we know from every study that has been put out is most of the people who see an original article or piece of video that is false or misleading never see the correction. So just like in the old days of newspapers, corrections show up 2 days later, they're not going to see the debunked piece of material. So the way we can fight it is pre-bunking it. So we know some of the topics bad actors are going to talk about in this election. We can get ahead of it by posting often with credible information so that the public is essentially inoculated to the disinformation when they see it. So for example, very basic, how, when, and where to vote. It is impossible to put out all the different pieces of false information you're likely to see. But if you have consistently pushed out the true, accurate, verified information, your friends, your community, your family will be inoculated when they see false information because they know the facts. Serve as trusted voices within your communities. This is where the League of Women Voters has a huge platform and an advantage, above and beyond just the general public, because people do look to you as being trusted sources of information. And then again, flood social traditional media with factual information as much as you can. And I'm quite bad at this because I don't personally use social media very often. But push out factual information over and over. It's not enough to post once about when election day is and kind of forget about it. You need to do it over and over again because, again, bad actors are doing the same thing on the other side. One of the other recommendations is to create information sharing mechanisms with other local leagues, whether that's in Maryland or across the country, so that you can share threats and you can share specific instances of disinformation when you see it, so that by the time, because often what we see are campaigns that are nationwide, or at least not specific to one location. So if you can share a threat that you're seeing early, another league can get ahead of it by saying, hey, we're seeing this in Montgomery County. This is why it's factually inaccurate. And again, can pre-bunk the information space. One of the other things that this is actually a project we're working on with Common Cause is to work with state and local officials to improve information security and to make sure that their accounts are verified and secure before the election. Again, in an election where more people are going to be seeking out information from election officials because of all the COVID-related changes, it is essential that our election officials actually have social media accounts that are verified, that are secured, and that are posting. This is a key thing that we don't see election officials do very often, is post often, and that's highly problematic. So I did a very quick review just based on some of the work we're doing with Common Cause to try to verify election-related social media accounts. So the good news is Montgomery County's election-related Twitter account is in excellent shape. It's actually one of the better Twitter accounts I've seen for an election official. It has a banner image, it has a profile photo, it has all of the information you need right there, and most importantly, it was active. I looked at it this afternoon, it had posted a few hours ago, so that's great news. So for you, there's less work to be done, at least with your own election officials. On the right there is where I went to high school, Chatham County, Georgia. Their Twitter account is in less great shape. It has no banner image, no photo, and it has never tweeted in the 8 years or 9 years it has been active. This is highly problematic. It's problematic because voters don't have information. It's problematic because that account is sitting there and is a sitting duck for bad actors to either hijack the account or spoof that account. So instead of Chatham GA, you just put Chatham GA1. You've created a fake, but seemingly real election official account from which you can push out disinformation that, of course, is going to be hugely problematic because most of the people receiving that information are going to think it is coming from a genuine election-related account. So to the extent that you can, work with the other leagues around Maryland, make sure your local officials, their Facebook accounts, their Twitter accounts are verified, they're secured, and they're tweeting, because that is essential in an election where people really, really need accurate information, particularly if things change with the health situation and there needs to be last-minute changes, again, to how, when, and where we'll vote. So I'm going to pause there for now just to open it up to questions. So yeah, fire away.
Okay, great. Speaking now is Linda Cohn, and Marcia and I work together in terms of arranging these programs. What we're going to do in terms of questions, we're going to ask people to raise their hand using the blue icon in the participant box. If you click on participants, and you should see a blue hand there. And raise your hand that way. We will continue to ask people to stay muted. If you have a question, use that blue icon, and then we will ask you to unmute yourself, preferably also share your video so we can see you. I think that helps the speaker. Certainly we'll unmute you, ask your question. Please try to be as clear and concise as possible. and then mute yourself back again. So we just want to get that down first in terms of the procedures we're going to use tonight. And before we jump in, I do see a question there, and we also had a question sent in advance into a mailbox. And before we even go there, I do want to say thank you to Bret. That's I'm always enjoy listening to you, even if you really kind of scare me a lot. But
I have that
do
effect on people.
Yes, you do. But very much appreciative of that presentation. And so I do see a hand raised from Chris Hager. So we'll start there, Chris, if you want to unmute yourself and ask your question of Bret.
I'd like to. Okay, here I am.
There you go, Chris.
You kind of brushed by it, but we had heard from a presentation from I think it was Montgomery County Board of Elections, that there were attempts to hack through our firewall last year, 4 years ago, and actually change votes or change who's registered. How concerned are you about that? And how concerned should we be about that?
So I will preface this by saying I am not a cybersecurity expert, but I obviously communicate quite often with other people who know more than I do. So I think it is without question a concern, but frankly, I think it is more likely that we will see, if we're taking sort of the foreign actors, so take the Russians, if we were to see this, we would see them essentially do what they did last time around, which is get into some systems and actually leave their fingerprints behind, so that when we do the sort of post-election audits, we know they were there, and we know they potentially could have changed things if they wanted to, which feeds into disinformation, of course, because if you have gotten in and reporting comes out and saying, hey, you know, Russians actually did get into the voter rolls, that gives them the opportunity, if there is a result in a state or a county that seems out of the ordinary or that has flipped from what we saw in 2016, to push disinformation campaigns saying, hey, you can't trust the votes because the Russians were in there. We have seen them doing that before, where they have essentially called themselves out for hacking. So what we saw in 2016 and 2018 was essentially priming the pump, saying that, you know, not this directly, but essentially we can get in there, we can change votes if you want to. So can you trust the votes? I don't know. And that's the real concern, is that leaving the question behind in people's mind. Again, especially if we see a result that is quite different than what we saw in 2016 or 2018, and there's evidence of at least some foul play, you create that level of doubt. And if people don't trust the results, of course, it's just as good as hacking the actual results. So my concern is more about hacking people's perception of the security of the vote, as opposed to actually getting in there and changing votes, which I just think is too risky for most states to actually go ahead and try to do that. I don't see them doing it, which doesn't mean we shouldn't be prepared for it. And I think we are actually in a better place than we were 4 years ago, my understanding from talking to election officials. They have done a lot of things to patch up those vulnerabilities, but it doesn't mean it couldn't happen. But again, my concern is more leaving behind the perception that they could have hacked things, as opposed to them actually hacking the vote.
Okay, great, thank you. There's a question from Gretchen Blankenship.
Yes, my question is about that restaurant, the Shed. When something like that goes immediately, meteorically fast to the top of many lists, do Google and Facebook and Twitter, do they start investigating what's going on, or is it too fast for them to actually do anything about it?
Well, they all have systems in place to detect what they call coordinated inauthentic behavior. So at some level, there are efforts at all of these platforms and these companies, including TripAdvisor, to try to catch this manipulation as it's happening. The issue with the TripAdvisor thing is actually that was a very slow churn towards virality, because it was actually real people who were just posting a bunch of positive reviews over a period of 7 or 8 months, which their systems probably wouldn't catch. If you see, to go to your example, something that just sort of gains almost instantaneous virality, if you're talking about a particular tweet that just gets liked thousands of times in an instant, their systems should catch that, and they often do. But that doesn't mean there aren't ways around it, and the more sophisticated actors understand the roadblocks that have been put up by the companies, and they just work around them. So we consistently see, in terms of tactics and techniques, I know the Russians best. As Facebook and Twitter get better, they get a little bit more sophisticated. They work around things. So for example, they weren't using a lot of operational security in 2016. There were accounts that were registering their Twitter account with a Russian mobile phone number, for example. We know they paid for political ads using rubles. Obviously, that's pretty easy to catch. That would be caught now. So what they've started doing is sort of hiring some of this out to troll farms in Africa, or using real Americans, often unwitting Americans, to run these campaigns for them. So to your question, that should be caught. And it will be, the really spam kind of activity gets caught. What's more problematic is the sophisticated activity. And what I'm concerned about this time around is less of the, as I mentioned, the sort of carpet bombing of social media with negative messaging. I don't think the Russians are going to try it. One, unfortunately, because I don't think they need to, because frankly, our conversations online are so toxic anyway. We don't need the help fighting each other. What I'm concerned about still is a targeted hack and leak campaign. So I'm still concerned about the targeted strikes that would likely be run by their intelligence agencies, who absolutely know how the companies detect things, and they try to work around them. So I think we're safer from what we experienced in 2016, which was just this polarizing content and this flood of false information. I don't think we're in a much better position for something like the Podesta leaks or the DNC leaks. I think they could still pull that off quite easily.
Thank you.
Great. Thank you. Thank you. There's a question from Jill Purdy.
Thank you, Brett. Thank you so much. This information is invaluable. You mentioned real quickly, you kind of alluded to a check, a blue check on Twitter, and you showed it real briefly. Are there other ways of folks detecting that they've got a verified good site, Facebook or other? That we
Facebook also uses what they call a blue badge, but essentially the same thing. The problem is they make it quite complicated to figure out how to verify your accounts. So right now, Twitter is actually, they have stopped verifying most people's accounts. So my organization does have a verified account, but we basically got that because I know the guy at Twitter. But they've generally stopped doing that, except for accounts of public interest. So if you're an election official, they will verify your account. But this is basically why we started doing this campaign with Common Cause, to do the work for election officials, to figure out which counties were not verified, because the process of doing it is pretty opaque, and there's just not clear instructions of A, B, C, you're verified. So that's really the only way on the platforms to show that you are a legitimate account, is to verify it. And all of the platforms have ways to do it. Unfortunately, many of them make it kind of cumbersome to verify your account. The one exception is accounts of public interest. So election-related accounts, they will verify, but you still just got to get it to the right person, which is sometimes easier said than done.
Okay, great. Thank you. I'm not seeing questions in the inbox, so please feel free to use that. We did have one question that was emailed to us in advance. So I will relay that one to you right now. And that one, the individual had written in and said, some people think that because they are registered with one party, they have to vote only for that party. And depending on the state, that may be true for the primary, but not the general. So are you aware of how spread this misunderstanding is, and if it's being used as part of a disinformation campaign?
I don't have any specific knowledge of that particular narrative going viral online. I'm sure it is. What I have seen, and that actually Ohio's Secretary of State was pretty good about debunking, is that there was a video that went viral on social media. I think the woman was in Florida, and this was not a disinformation campaign. It was factually accurate. She had received in the mail during the primary. I guess she lived with her brother, and she's a Republican, he's a Democrat, and they noticed on their mail-in ballot that it essentially in the code said whether or not you were a Republican or a Democrat on the outside of the envelope. This was true in Florida, but is not true in most states, and is definitely not true in the general election. So one of the things that we saw the Secretary of State of Ohio do that was, I think, quite effective is he did a video that was then put on Twitter where he walked voters through, what a ballot looks like, that yes, this exists in Florida. It existed during the primary, but it wouldn't in the general election. So I think this goes back to what I was trying to stress of pre-bunking the information space. If we know that this is a narrative that's out there, that's sort of pinging around social media, instead of trying to directly address it, just put out what the real information is and do it often. I often try to say, like, we can't solve the world of fake news and false information. We can make our communities, our families, people we follow who follow us more informed. So if you just think about educating the people around you in your circle, as opposed to fighting this sort of viral piece of disinformation and, that you've got to tackle the entire thing at once, I think that's probably a more effective way to combat something like that.
Great, great, thank you. We do have a question from Arthur Becker.
How can we get this type of information to the audience, such as young people, who are much more likely than the group I see on the screen, who are listening to this type of information? How do we get the information to them?
That is a great question, and I have not been able to figure that out in my entire time working in public diplomacy or in my current job. And I think this is the issue we have anytime you're doing sort of public service type announcements, is you're often preaching to the choir. And I know giving this presentation, I am preaching to people who are not pushing out false information on social media. So that's why I try to stress, the way to combat it is just push out more factual information, understand how things are manipulated, educating people around you. But I don't frankly know the answer to that. The one thing I will say in terms of your framing of young people being more susceptible to it, there's actually a split between young and old in terms of their media and digital literacy. So what young people are quite bad at is actually understanding what a credible outlet should do, what credible journalism should look like, and the sort of basic tenets of journalism that should be followed. They aren't really very good at that. And they don't have the ability really to discern legitimate from illegitimate sources, where the older generation does, because I include myself there. We grew up with CBS News and the New York Times, and we just kind of understand how journalism should work. What has been found in most of the academic research into the spread of false or misleading information on social media is actually one of the really problematic demographics is the over 50 or 65 crowd, I forget which one, that they found a preponderance of truly fake information was actually coming from that group, who is smarter about understanding sources, less savvy about digital manipulation. So not really understanding Photoshop, not really understanding how small edits to a video can mislead people in terms of the content, like the Nancy Pelosi video that went viral on Facebook. So we see this split in terms of our concern about different demographics and how they engage with the information space. So that's just, I know that's not directly answering your question because I can't, and I really don't know how to get to really the problematic groups. So if you figure that out, please let me know, because I've been failing for 3 years.
Okay, hopefully he'll let us all know that. We have a question, a hand raised here from Victoria Ludwig.
Hi, thanks so much for your presentation. And I think you may have halfway answered my question, which is, what can we do as individuals? The tips you gave are really great for the League of Women Voters, and I will obviously share and retweet things that come out from the league. But other than that, are there any top tips as individuals to help combat this or educate people about how this works, the disinformation?
Yeah, I mean, at the individual level, and again, this is not advice that I think this crowd likely needs, but we often talk about this sort of boiling down to an individual problem, that when you look at coordinated efforts to spread disinformation coming again from the Russians, which is the sort of campaigns I know best, they try to get real individuals to pick up and run with a false narrative. So that is a strategic tactic, is to get kind of on the radar of individuals, particularly individuals who have credibility within their community, or who are celebrities who have some sort of elevated kind of role in society. So one of the things we stress, of course, is it comes down to the individual to not share things unless they know it to be true. And often it's almost more than that, of not kind of falling victim to emotional posts. So when you see the posts out there that are trying to sort of tweak, the various sort of partisan levers, to kind of walk away from it, to take a few minutes, not to try to amplify false information, because of course that's what they want you to do. I'm assuming that's not a problem for this crowd again, but I think it is a thing to, talk to your friends, to talk to your kids about, of not kind of being a part, often unwitting, in spreading disinformation. And that comes down to, just be very cautious about what you're engaging with and what you're sharing. In terms of what an individual can do, kind of more from the league perspective, I think I outlined the main things, but again, I would sort of boil it down to just make sure that people in your feeds, in your space, in your communities, have the right information about when to vote, how to vote. That is critical, and I think goes a long way actually to fighting disinformation, because people know the facts. They don't have to search out false information. If they see things coming into their feed, they know it to be false. So that, I think, is really the individual role that's key in all this.
Thank you.
Thank you. Marcia Kingman also submitted a question, says that you mentioned that disinformation campaigns attack down ballot campaigns. Did that happen in 2018? Do you see it happening now in 2020?
So we know less about the specific attacks on down ballot candidates, other than we know in almost every election there have been disinformation campaigns, likely run from domestic actors, that have targeted smaller races. And this is just sort of obvious, because for the same reason people care about political outcomes at the national, they care about political outcomes at the local level. And it's frankly much easier to carry out that kind of disinformation campaign. Because if you talk about the national election, you really do need resources to influence the amount of voters that would take to swing an election one way or another. If you're talking, I lived in California for many years, where we have ballot measures every year, where people know very little about typically. Voters don't come to those elections with a lifetime of experience and their political leanings and all of the biases inherent there that are kind of tough to shape and move. So it is quite easy to target a ballot measure where people just don't really know the facts behind it. It's quite easy to target a smaller race where there's just less coverage in traditional media of the candidates. So that's why I'm particularly concerned about the down ballot candidates, just because it is frankly so much easier and so much cheaper to pull off. And because frankly, people like me, anyone I know in the disinformation space, just doesn't have the bandwidth to look at every election. So this is an area I think actually, I talk to local journalists quite often, but I think the league can be helpful of monitoring those races. And if you're seeing things that appear to be coordinated and targeting a specific candidate or issue, to flag those, because frankly there's not that many of us in the disinformation space, including at the platforms, who can look in all of the different elections and all of the different issues that are being discussed.
Okay, great, thank you. Question from Diane Habino.
Hi, Bret and everybody. I wanted to answer Victoria's question and also talk a little bit about what we can do and how our boards of election are working to try to stymie the misinformation and disinformation that's out there. There's a program called Squint, SQUINT, that has been started by MITRE Corporation of Northern Virginia, and they reached out to our area leagues of women voters because of our good reputation. And what it is a system where if you're on social media and you see something that doesn't seem quite right, you can use their app and warn them and say, this doesn't seem right on Facebook, Twitter, whatever, and they will check it out. And if it's true and it's not good information, they will let our Board of Elections know right away. So this is a way that we as individuals who use social media can help monitor what's out there. We have a member, Joan Siegel, who is our contact person here in the Montgomery League. And I don't know, Bret, if you've heard of this program.
I have. I know it quite well, actually. So that is great advice.
Okay, good. So if anybody's interested, perhaps leaving your name and email, and we can get you to Joan Siegel. Thanks.
No, that's a great point. And the information sharing mechanisms that I touched on, but I didn't get into the specifics. It's incredibly important because one of the things is the platforms get so many reports of terms of service violations every day. And in some ways, many of those are intentionally just to flood the system so they can't actually deal with credible threats. That there is no way for them to just respond to every single thing that an individual user flags for the companies. If you just flag something as being disinformation and send it through to Twitter, it's going to go into a black hole and it will not be dealt with. So it is much, much more effective if you're able to information share through a sort of a kind of a clearinghouse like MITRE has set up, so that they're able to ticket and elevate the really sort of credible threats, because then the companies can actually respond to it in a way they can't respond if 200,000 people are just sending in individual instances. So that's a great recommendation.
Great, thank you. Question from Cynthia Body Willis.
Good evening, everybody. I'm just wondering, we've worked hard to become a trusted organization in Montgomery County and beyond. I'm just wondering, is there anything that we ought to be thinking about or could be doing to protect our presence on the various platforms that we're on, so that we don't get hijacked in a sense, or the information that we put out there is not misused?
Yeah, no, it's a great question. I would, if you have a contact at Twitter, and if you don't, I might be able to direct you to one. I feel like League of Women Voters should qualify as an account of public interest, and they should verify it, even though officially they have stopped verifying accounts. So that would be one. But step two would be whoever runs that account, or whoever runs, the many League accounts in Maryland, to make sure that you have two-factor or multi-factor authentication on the account, which essentially means, instead of just putting in a password, you have to put in a password and then go to your phone where you have an authenticator and you just have to press a button. That would solve the vast majority of simple hacking efforts to get into accounts and hijack accounts. It's possible to work around, but you need a very, very sophisticated actor. It's not just going to be some kid screwing around who wants to get in the League of Women Voters account and cause problems. So two-factor, multi-factor would in most instances protect you from that. And then the final thing, again, who's ever running the account, just make sure that they're checking it regularly. Again, my concern was some of these Twitter accounts associated with election officials. And with Common Cause, we've now looked at roughly 1,000 counties and their social media accounts. Many of them have not posted in the last 6 months. Some of them have not posted in the last 6 years on these accounts, which means nobody is paying attention. So if somebody took it over, started to use it for malicious purposes, the original owner is probably going to be completely unaware that's happened. So someone who's just monitoring actively and would be able to see, like, I don't know exactly who posted this and could take action quickly, that would be helpful too. But two-factor, multi-factor is the #1 recommendation.
Great, thank you. Question from Janet Fox.
Hi, I was on the league meeting maybe a week or so ago. There was a discussion for September, and it had to do with spotting fake news. And I just thought this handout that was part of that discussion guide was really helpful. And I was wondering what you guys thought about it, and if there's a way to really use this as a tool, because it was very simple for me to kind of keep it as a little checklist. So I'm just putting that out there as maybe something to share further.
No, I think that's very helpful. And there's a lot of organizations who do great work. First Draft is one. I'm blanking on others, but Pen America put out a great sort of checklist similar to that. So there's a lot of resources out there that can kind of walk users through how to spot things. I tend to spend a little bit less time in my presentations to, activist communities and voting rights groups about spotting, because I want them to be more active in pushing out factual, credible information to fight it that way. But there are fantastic resources out there that have checklists of walking through. And I think also, something like that is very helpful to share, again, within your communities. Because going back to the question that was asked earlier, how do we get information to the groups that often are problematic in terms of sharing and spreading fake news? So the more that you can put out viral pieces of content like that, I think the better, because it's shareable, it's something people can pass around. So I think that's great.
Great, thank you. Question from Sharon Campbell. Sharon, do you want to unmute yourself?
Unmute.
There you go.
Oh, here we go. Sorry. So this is really interesting. I want to circle back around to Squint, because my original question was how to form those relationships with the social media. And you said Squint is great. And I think the league had, excuse me, a session on that. So what I think I heard from your response, Bret, is that maybe the league should spread the information about Squint and how to use it to our members and others, and ask, excuse me, ask our members to share that information with their Facebook friends and whatnot. Is that correct?
Diane, you might know more than me. I don't know what each individual organization has to do to become essentially a verified member of Squint. I know that they want sort of trusted sources to be part of the network, so that they're sure that when they are actually getting threats reported to them, it is coming from reliable people. So I'm not sharing it with other leagues, I think, is something that definitely should happen. So you're sharing it among kind of credible voices. I think it might, I don't think it would be problematic necessarily, but it might not just be effective to share it with your general kind of Facebook community, because most people, I don't think, can actually be a part of Squint, because I think Squint works on this sort of trusted, verified voices, so that they know the incoming is all coming from people that they can trust and are credible messengers. So again, other people may know more about the specifics of how to join Squint, but my recommendation is make sure everyone in the league community knows about it. But I'm not sure just kind of average users. I'm pretty sure actually you can't just be sort of an average user on Facebook and use the Squint system. I think it really is for trusted organizations and individuals.
Okay, so maybe we have, and maybe somebody already said this, maybe we have a point person that we can send that information to, and then that information should be shared, who we send our, possible problems to.
Yes, I think so. That is great, is to have kind of a central point where these things can be elevated to, because what the platforms don't want to deal with, and they don't deal with well, is getting flooded with takedown requests and different notifications that something on their platform is false or misleading. Oftentimes it's not going to violate their terms of service, and it just means that they can't actually get to the credible threats. So any way that you can just keep kind of filtering information about a specific campaign to an individual source. So, you know, one point of contact at your league, one point across the various leagues in Maryland, that goes to Squint. Squint then can elevate it and take it directly to the platforms themselves. That's when things work better. Stanford also has an election-related project that we're a part of that does sort of a similar thing. So it's Stanford, University of Washington, University of Wisconsin, and Graphica, which is a social media analytics company in New York, and then many trusted partners. So we all sort of send in what we're seeing if it looks to be problematic into this kind of clearinghouse that Stanford has set up, which again is a way of kind of making sure that really credible threats are elevated to the companies and they're not just getting bombarded with, you know, for the most part, well-meaning people who are just flooding them with instances that they think violate their terms of service.
Okay.
Linda, Joan Siegel has put her email address in the
that's
chat
what I was-
box for anybody who wants to know about Squint.
Right, that's what I was just looking at as well. Joan says you can contact her directly, and her email is in there. So feel free to check that chat box to get that. There is a question, I will ask her to unmute, from Nicole Williams. So if you want to unmute yourself, and you're on, Nicole.
Hello.
Nicole, do you want to unmute yourself?
There we go.
There we go.
Forth there. All right. Hey, Brent, thank you very much for your information. One, I am one of the ones responsible for our League of Montgomery County channels, and I'm very familiar with the two-factor verification.
Good.
I am interested in your connection to Twitter because we actually have an old account. It would be great to be able to either totally delete that or merge it to kind of keep that from being a possible target. But my real question is about Facebook, and if you have encountered issues where while we're trying to put this information out, it has been reported that for those who have taken the time to turn notifications on from us or anyone else, and that's in general, Facebook has actually turned notifications off. And the first time I heard this report, it was by the group Color of Change, and they were having, you know, issues with that. So, you know, one, it's like you're fighting the algorithm that doesn't actually show all of your information to your current followers because of the whole paid ad situation. And now you have to either warn your followers about it or constantly say, hey, make sure your notifications are turned on. What do you do about that?
Yeah, that's a real problem if that was happening at Facebook, and it wouldn't totally surprise me. You know, that goes to a bigger problem of this sort of opacity of what Facebook and these companies are doing, because there's no oversight at all. So when these kind of things happen, we kind of have to rely on Facebook's kind of internal audits to, you know, reveal if things like this are going on, which we never know about. And it also goes to, you know, nobody really understands how their algorithms work and how the news feeds work. And it's a problem of getting credible information in front of the right people. I mean, if that happens, I would hope that if you were able to take that to the right person, which again is easier said than done sometimes at Facebook, that they would deal with that quickly, because to be honest, what motivates them is the potential for bad PR. And I think they would be quite concerned about hearing something like that and having that come out in the press. So, you know, I'm not kind of advocating for, you know, threatening Facebook that you're going to go to the press, but I do think if you took that to the right person at Facebook, they should hopefully deal with that. You know, although the companies aren't always great at dealing with these kind of issues. The one thing Facebook has done, and I very rarely am I very complimentary of Facebook, but one thing they have done with this election, which is a good thing, is if you are a verified election official page, they will elevate posts that come out of that page up and through the election. So that's why it's particularly important. You know, as I mentioned, this effort, we're working with Common Cause, but we're not actually working in Maryland. So it would be great, you know, more people just kind of talk to their own election officials. Verifying an account doesn't only protect it, it actually elevates the information coming out of that account on Facebook, because they will essentially flag that account as being of particular public interest. So it'll go to the top of people's feeds in whatever community, you know, the election account is connected to. So I know that doesn't quite answer your question, because I would have to kind of know the specifics. My guess would be Facebook would rectify that if you got it to the right person, just because they would be concerned that that would come out in the press and not look particularly great. But I don't honestly know why that would have happened in the first place, and it's concerning if it is happening.
Okay, thank you. Question, hand raised from Yoxan Reynolds.
Thank you, Linda. Well, Bret, you have given us a very good understanding of how Russia approaches election disinformation or malinformation. Our president has raised the idea that we have newer players, Iran and China. Have you seen examples of how they are approaching, or whether they are, and how they're approaching election disinformation, and in what ways are they different from what Russia has been doing? Are they less sophisticated? Do they have different targets, different objectives?
It's a great question, and one I actually can answer quite well, because we have built a dashboard that tracks in real time all of the messaging coming out of Iranian, Chinese, and Russian state-backed media outlets, all of their diplomats, all of their government officials. So every official attributable count that they have on Twitter, we track and collect, and we track and collect all of their English language websites and all of their English language YouTube channels. So like RT America, for example. So we have a pretty comprehensive understanding about how the three countries have talked about the election, how they go about just their messaging in general. I would say in the information space, I mean, I know Iran and China are always a hacking threat to some degree, but we are just not seeing the evidence from China and Iran that they are doing the same thing that Russia has done in the past and is currently doing. It appears to be quite different. And I know there is concern broadly on our team, but also others, that some of the intelligence reporting that has come out has been a bit politicized and has tried to conflate what we know Russia is doing, and it has been pretty accurately reported by the intelligence community, with what China and Iran are doing. And I think the big distinction is, so from China, yes, China tends to message fairly negatively about President Trump. So you could take that to mean that they have a preference for Biden. Although I know some China experts who aren't quite so sure about that. But if you're just going from the open source, it looks like they have a preference for President Trump, but there's a lot of negative messaging. But a preference for a candidate is very different from acting on that preference and acting in a malicious way. So China's state media putting out content that is critical of the Trump administration is very different from Russia, for example, working to hack and release the Biden Poroshenko tapes of the conversations that they had about issues in Ukraine. It's very different from running trolling operations, pretending to be Americans to mislead Americans. And I think that is the huge distinction is, you know, we have significant evidence of Russia doing it. We have a little bit of evidence of Iran trying it, but to be honest, Iran is just not particularly sophisticated. Their state media is not very good. It doesn't have a huge audience in the US. It doesn't seem to be working particularly well. And then China, which again, in the overt space, we can see they do message negatively about Trump, more negatively than Biden, but we have not seen evidence of them really interfering in the election. And I think that's a huge distinction that hasn't been made particularly clear in some of the intelligence reports that have come out.
Okay, great, thank you. I think that I'm not seeing other questions in our other hands raised in the box. So and we're approaching, I think, the end of our time. So I'm going to ask you one last question, just because I can. That is, I hear all of the points that you're raising in terms of what we can do individually, how to recognize it, how to individually try to counter or be cognizant of some of those, recognize some of those things, the disinformation that is happening, what the League of Women Voters can do to help pre-bunk and debunk information. Who, if anybody, has responsibility, do you think, for helping try to get at the underlying issue on this? Is there a role for more government regulation? Is there more ways to hold some of the social media companies more accountable, or help them hold themselves more accountable? How do we start getting at some of the underlying issue on this?
Great question, and my answer would be all of the above, what you just laid out. I do think there is a role for government regulation, a limited role that doesn't deal with the content problem. So, I laid out the actor behavior content side of things. I think content immediately gets fraught for obvious First Amendment reasons, but you can go after the behavioral issues, and you can have greater oversight into the tech companies, just to make sure that they're doing what they're saying they're doing. The same way that we have oversight into, the banks. There are third-party audits of the banks so that they aren't just allowed to audit themselves and put out reports saying, everything looks fine. And I think one of the key things is, at this point, what we buy, the issues that we care about, the candidates we vote for, all of it is at some level, and in some cases at a large level, being determined by algorithms that the people at the companies don't fully understand themselves. I think that is, as a baseline, hugely problematic. There just has to be a way for there to be some external oversight into what these companies are doing, because their impact and their influence is just so enormous worldwide. And we're talking in the US context, where we have, it doesn't always feel like it right now, but a pretty robust democracy, and we have a long tradition of an independent media. If you start talking about their impact in places like Myanmar and developing countries, it has been a complete disaster, the rollout of Facebook there. It has led to genocides, it has led to authoritarians taking over more control. So there has to be, I think, not only some, again, limited government regulation, definitely some oversight, but also more of a kind of agreement in the transatlantic space with other democracies about what an open democratic internet looks like. And I think we are slowly moving in that direction, but we're behind. In terms of the specific threats, when we talk about disinformation, a lot of that, I think, is ultimately going to fall on the companies. Just because they have access to data that those of us who work in kind of the open source intelligence world just can't see. I mean, there's just no way for me, looking at individual Twitter or Facebook accounts, to understand the kind of back-end manipulation I was talking about. So there's a lot of reliability that falls on the companies, and I think if you're looking at the pressure point there, it's advertisers. We tend to think that the company's clients are its users. We are not the clients, we are their product. Their clients are the advertisers. And the more that advertisers force the companies to get better about taking down extremist content and to try to eliminate some of the virality of the more polarizing content, the more we get advertisers to say, we're just not going to advertise on your platform if this kind of behavior is allowed to go on or continue. That's going to have the biggest impact, because they are, at their core, advertising platforms. And we've seen some of that. Unilever a couple of years ago came out and said to YouTube, because their ads were running up against jihadist videos, we're just not going to put advertisements on your platform unless you figure this out. And things got better. So I think the advertising ecosystem, and I could spend hours on the ad ecosystem and what needs to happen there, because the digital advertising space is so enormously complicated. I've spent weeks trying to understand it. I barely understand it. But for the most part, advertisers don't even understand where their ads are going. And so this is a problem too. And I think that's where we need to get some regulation so that there's more transparency, because right now, a lot of these extremists, a lot of these disinformation sites are being funded by advertisers who have no idea that their ads are being placed on these platforms, because it's all just this sort of black magic of third-party ad tech. And until we get until we get to the point where that's transparent for the advertisers, I don't think we're going to be able to kind of fix some of the underlying problems. So limited government relations and going after the advertising industry, I think, are two kind of top of mind things that would help the general health of our information space.
Great, great, interesting. Thank you. Want to thank you for really a wonderful presentation tonight. I'm very grateful that you and all of your colleagues that you work with are on top of this issue, because it's extraordinarily complicated, and I try to learn as much as I can every time, but it's people like you who watch it and look at it and take the time to explain to us what is going on and help us understand as well. So thank you so much for that. I want to note for others that we have a couple upcoming events as well in October. October 5th, we're having a Board of Education candidate forum, and October 12th, we will be having a very timely session about voting in Montgomery County. We'll be hearing from Dr. Zelaya from the Board of Elections, and also one of our very own league members to talk about the ballot questions that are on the up for the election in November that everybody would be asked to vote on. So those are two upcoming sessions that you should mark your calendar, October 5th and October 12th. And I will also give one last thank you to everybody who listened today and joined us today, and much appreciation to Bret as well. So thank you so much, and good evening to everybody.
And thank you for all that you do, because we rely on you to get the information to the voters.
Great.
Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.
Good night.
Good night.